U.S. and Ukraine discuss energy takeover. Russia strongly opposes. On March the 19th, U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a phone call to discuss the possibility of the U.S. taking over Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including the operation of nuclear power plants. On March the 22nd, U.S. Energy Secretary Tris stated that Washington has no issue with operating energy facilities in Ukraine. In response, Yuri Chenischuk, director of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, declared, "I can say one thing, no one will have the right to control our plant, no matter how much they want it." He emphasized that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant belongs to Russia and will be operated in accordance with Russian law. The Zaporizhzhia plant, the largest in Europe, has been under Russian control since March 2022. The Zaporizhzhia region also held a referendum and voted to join Russian territory later that year. Since mid-2023, the plant has largely ceased operations due to the threat of shelling, drone attacks, UAV, and disrupted water supply. Both Moscow and Kyiv have repeatedly accused each other of attacks that endanger the safety of the facility. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has maintained a monitoring mission at the plant since September 2022. In early March, President Zelensky stated that the Zaporizhzhia plant cannot function without Kyiv's oversight. He stressed that Ukraine needs funding and technical experts to restore operations. The plant is currently managed by a subsidiary of Russia's state nuclear energy corporation, Rosatom. In December 2024, the plant CEO announced plans to restart operations once security conditions are fully ensured.
Russia intensifies integration of occupied Ukrainian territories. As the world closely watches Russia's next move regarding the temporary ceasefire agreement with Ukraine proposed by the United States, questions remain about whether true peace can be achieved between the two nations. However, one undeniable fact is that even if the fighting temporarily subsides, the Ukrainian territories under Russian control are gradually being integrated into Moscow's administrative, passport, and education systems. Increased administrative control in occupied Ukrainian territories. According to France 24 on March 13th, Moscow's control over eastern Ukrainian territories has become increasingly systematic. Officials from Helping to Leave, an organization assisting Ukrainian citizens in evacuating occupied areas, reported that Russian checkpoints have become common at city entrances, rural regions, and major roadways. These checkpoints allow Russian forces to regulate access to different areas and scrutinize the identification documents of civilians. For those attempting to leave Russian-occupied territories for Ukrainian-controlled regions, the journey involves first passing through Russia and Belarus before reaching Ukraine's northwestern border. Border inspections at Russian checkpoints can take hours or even days. Russian border guards reportedly pay special attention to young Ukrainian men, most of whom have already been issued Russian passports and risk being conscripted into the Russian military. "We can never guarantee that Russian border guards won't detain them. It's like a lottery," said Sofia, a representative from Helping to Leave. Last week, the Kremlin announced that it had issued 3.5 million Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens in the occupied regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, 4 territories Moscow declared annexed in September 2022. President Vladimir Putin confirmed that the passportization process in eastern Ukraine is largely complete, solidifying Russia's control over these areas. Forced integration and population resettlement. In occupied Ukrainian territories, those without Russian passports are classified as foreign nationals, stripping them of property ownership rights, pension benefits, and access to health care and social welfare. The Russian government has also been using humanitarian aid as a means to encourage people to accept Russian citizenship. This includes financial assistance for relocation to Russia, subsidies for families with newborns registered as Russian citizens, and other economic incentives. According to researcher Jaroslava Papieri from PB University in the UK, children in Russian-occupied schools are required to follow the Russian education curriculum. The Ukrainian language, literature, and history have been completely replaced with Russian language, Russian literature, and Russian history. Any mention of Ukraine has been removed from textbooks introduced by Moscow, Papieri stated. While some parents continue to educate their children online following Ukraine's national curriculum, such actions must be done discreetly. Anything perceived as support for Ukraine has become dangerous. Even speaking Ukrainian in public could lead to arrest, Sofia warned. Strengthened Russian control and territorial consolidation. The Russian government has announced plans to build 25 new prisons and 6 detention centers in occupied Ukrainian territories by 2026. Additionally, Moscow is pushing forward with a resettlement program to bring Russian citizens into these regions. New legislation permits the confiscation of abandoned properties, while financial aid is provided to Russian citizens seeking to purchase homes in these territories. As of March 2024, at least 1,785 apartments and businesses in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia have been seized. The tightening of control over all aspects of life in occupied territories indicates that Russia is gradually incorporating these areas into its administrative system. Analyst Papieri commented, although President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine will never recognize any occupied territory as part of Russia, the longer these regions remain under Russian control, the harder it will be to reclaim them. Putin adjusts negotiation strategy and ceasefire agreement with Ukraine. By agreeing in principle to the necessity of a ceasefire while outlining accompanying challenges, Russian President Vladimir Putin is believed to be employing a strategic negotiation tactic with the United States and Ukraine. Previously, Washington and Kiev had jointly proposed a 30-day ceasefire across the entire front, forcing Moscow to make a decision. According to The Telegraph, President Putin had 3 options to consider. The first was to accept the 30-day ceasefire proposal, but risk losing battlefield advantages. The second was to reject it outright, potentially provoking a strong response from the U.S. The third, Putin's chosen approach, was to respond in a way that avoids appearing opposed to peace while maximizing battlefield gains. Russia uses negotiations to buy time and strengthen battlefield progress. By thanking the U.S. president for efforts toward peace, Putin seeks to avoid escalating tensions with Washington. At the same time, he has outlined numerous factors that must be discussed in any potential ceasefire, signaling that peace must be sustainable and supported by clear mechanisms. Analysts suggest that Russia will break down proposals into detailed components, appearing cooperative while prolonging the process to consolidate its battlefield position. This tactic increases pressure on Ukraine in future negotiations. Currently, Russia is intensifying its campaign to push Ukrainian forces entirely out of the Kursk front, an area that Kiev has held for 8 months as a bargaining chip in Donbas negotiations. Moscow is exploiting Ukraine's shortage of weapons and manpower to gain more territory. In a recent statement, Putin posed the question, if Russia agrees to a ceasefire now, how will the situation in Kursk be resolved when Moscow is surrounding large numbers of Ukrainian troops? He also laid out several conditions, including a freeze on Ukrainian troop recruitment, an end to new soldier training, and a ban on receiving military aid during the ceasefire period. Additionally, he proposed mechanisms to monitor compliance and define ceasefire violations, complex issues that may take time to negotiate. U.S. faces decision on pressuring or conceding to Russia. Russia's strategy of fragmenting ceasefire terms and imposing multiple conditions forces the U.S. to reassess its next steps. According to The Telegraph, Putin has shifted the responsibility onto Washington, forcing the U.S. to choose between increasing pressure on Russia or persuading Ukraine to make concessions to accelerate the peace process. On March 13th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen stated that she is prepared to significantly increase sanctions on Russia if necessary to resolve the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump asserted that the U.S. has leverage over Russia but is not yet ready to use it. Trump acknowledged that Putin's statement was promising but incomplete, indicating that the White House recognizes Russia's ambiguous stance. The key question now is how much pressure the U.S. can exert on Russia, and whether Washington can convince Ukraine to make concessions for a quicker resolution to the conflict. Some experts suggest the U.S. may adopt a carrot-and-stick approach toward Moscow, simultaneously warning of sanctions while offering potential economic, trade, or Arctic cooperation incentives. However, with Russia holding the upper hand on the battlefield, there's little reason for Moscow to agree to a ceasefire at this stage. According to The Telegraph, if Washington hopes to persuade Moscow to halt its offensive, it may need to offer incentives substantial enough for Russia to deem the trade-off worthwhile.
Poland wishes the U.S. success in negotiations with Russia. Ukraine sets red lines for peace talks. On March 18th, Polish television channel TVP reported that the country's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, wished U.S. President Donald Trump good luck ahead of his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding the Ukraine issue. Sikorski expressed hope that Trump would succeed in persuading Putin to abandon what he described as unreasonable demands. Speaking at a meeting of European Union (EU) foreign ministers in Brussels on March 17th, Sikorski emphasized, Putin could end this war in 5 minutes simply by withdrawing his troops from Ukraine. He also expressed hope that the U.S. president would demonstrate his negotiation skills, adding, "We will assess the success of Trump's talks based on the quality of the peace agreement achieved." Ukrainian experts doubt U.S.-Russia negotiations will succeed. Contrary to Poland's expectations, some Ukrainian political experts remain skeptical about the effectiveness of Trump and Putin's phone conversation. Volodymyr Senko, director of the Penta Center for Policy Studies, told Polish news agencies that he does not expect much from the discussion. According to Fesenko, Russian President Putin will attempt to convince Trump that Moscow is ready to negotiate, but only under the condition that Ukraine makes concessions. He warned, it will depend on Trump whether he agrees to this, and whether there will be a new wave of pressure on Ukraine to force us into making some concessions to Russia. The expert also stressed that Ukraine will not accept any ultimatum from Russia, particularly concerning territorial concessions or abandoning its NATO membership aspirations. There will be no agreement on Ukraine withdrawing from Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, and no compromise on us abandoning our NATO ambitions, Fesenko asserted. Ukraine sets red lines for peace talks. According to The Independent, UK on March 16th, Ukraine has outlined several red lines as the US pushes for a ceasefire agreement with Russia. These conditions include no further territorial concessions, despite Russia's desire to gain full control over 4 Ukrainian regions, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, which Moscow has claimed and partially occupied. Return of thousands of Ukrainian children. Kyiv accuses Russia of illegally taking Ukrainian children out of the country and demands their immediate return. Release of unlawfully detained civilians. Ukraine calls on Russia to free civilians it has detained illegally, stating that these individuals are not prisoners of war and should not be included in any prisoner exchange lists. International security guarantees. Ukraine insists on international oversight and guarantees to prevent Russia from violating any future ceasefire agreement. These tough conditions highlight Ukraine's firm stance in negotiations with Russia, while posing a major challenge to U.S. diplomatic efforts to secure a long-term peace settlement for the ongoing conflict.
U.S. withdraws from Ukraine conflict investigation, moves toward normalizing relations with Russia. According to the New York Times, the U.S. Department of Justice has recently decided to withdraw from an investigation into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which was initiated by the International Criminal Justice Organization and led by the European Union, EU. The U.S. joined the organization in 2023, becoming its only non-European member. Sources indicate that Washington informed its European partners of this decision before making an official announcement. U.S. officials cited government budget cuts as the reason for the withdrawal. Previously, the U.S. Department of Justice had pledged $1 million in support of European investigators upon joining the organization. Additionally, the Biden administration is scaling back operations of the World Cat Group within the U.S. Department of Justice. This group was established in 2022 to train Ukrainian prosecutors in prosecuting and trying Russian nationals accused of war crimes. Last week, the U.S. also reduced funding for a Yale University research group that was investigating cases of Ukrainian children allegedly taken to Russia. Moscow has denied these accusations, claiming they are misinformation intended to discredit Russia's evacuation efforts from conflict zones. Meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump is focusing on normalizing bilateral relations with Russia, considering the resolution of the Ukraine conflict as a key step forward. The American leader is expected to hold a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin this week to discuss the next steps in their diplomatic engagement. The U.S. may concede to Russia's demands to end the conflict with Ukraine. According to interviews with senior officials and previously unpublished documents accessed by KB News, the United States is gradually moving toward accepting Russia's key demands to end the conflict in Ukraine. Washington may support the Kremlin's four-point peace plan, weaken Kiev's position, and push for a global campaign to replace Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The documents indicate that Washington is increasingly receptive to Moscow's stance on the origins of the conflict, which emphasizes NATO expansion and alleged discrimination against Russian speakers in Ukraine. According to multiple sources, Moscow is growing confident that the U.S. is willing to meet most of Russia's demands, including making Zelensky's replacement a prerequisite for any peace negotiations. The apparent shift in the U.S. stance is believed to stem from direct negotiations between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, as well as ongoing peace talks in Saudi Arabia. The warming bilateral relationship between Washington and Moscow has encouraged the Kremlin to put forward a series of non-negotiable demands, which Russia hopes will serve as the foundation for any peace agreement. According to sources within the Ukrainian diplomatic and intelligence community, the U.S. may be open to conceding at least 4 key points in Moscow's plan. Ending Western military support, Russia demands that the U.S. and its allies halt all arms transfers, intelligence sharing, and military training for Ukrainian forces. It remains unclear whether this demand applies solely to U.S. aid or includes European assistance as well. Recognizing Russian-controlled territories. Moscow seeks international recognition of Crimea, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk as part of Russian territory. These regions were annexed by Russia following controversial referendums. Restoring Russian cultural and religious influence in Ukraine. Russia demands that Ukraine reintegrate the Russian language, Russian media, and the Russian Orthodox Church into daily life, reversing post-2014 policies aimed at reducing Moscow's influence. Returning to the terms of the Istanbul Agreement, Russia wants Ukraine to adhere to the commitments outlined in the peace agreement negotiated in March 2022, which included Ukrainian neutrality, security guarantees, and military limitations in exchange for a Russian troop withdrawal. Experts warn that reverting to the Istanbul Agreement could compromise Ukraine's security and sovereignty. However, it remains uncertain how far Washington is willing to go in making concessions to Moscow, or how Kiev will respond to these developments. U.S. opposes tough rhetoric on Russia. G7 struggles to reach consensus on joint statement. Ahead of the G7 summit set to take place at a riverside resort in Quebec from March 12th to 14th, the U.S. Secretary of State has stated that Washington opposes language that could hinder efforts to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table. Since Russia was suspended from the G7 in March 2014, the group's meetings have consistently reached a consensus. However, the situation shifted when former U.S. President Donald Trump altered U.S. foreign policy, moving closer to Moscow while increasing pressure on Kyiv. According to G7 diplomats, Canada initially hoped that member states would agree on a joint statement covering a wide range of issues, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Middle East, and China. However, reaching an agreement has proven difficult due to ongoing disagreements among members. Disagreements over the joint statement. The draft G7 statement emphasizes efforts to curb Russia's shadow fleet, a term used by Western nations to describe Russian vessels that covertly transport oil, weapons, and grain while evading Western detection. The most recent G7 statement in November 2023 devoted nearly a quarter of its content to Ukraine, primarily criticizing Russia. However, this time, achieving a unified stance is proving to be much more challenging. 2 anonymous diplomats revealed that the U.S. is pushing to remove references to sanctions against Russia and its military operations in Ukraine, while advocating for harsher language against China. The U.S. emphasizes diplomacy. Speaking en route to Saudi Arabia for negotiations with Ukrainian officials, the U.S. Secretary of State acknowledged that discussions were at a standstill. Washington insists that it cannot endorse any statement that could obstruct diplomatic efforts to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table. We believe that confrontational rhetoric can sometimes make negotiations more difficult, especially now, when the U.S. is the only party capable of facilitating such talks, the Secretary of State emphasized. Additionally, the U.S. is opposing the release of a separate statement on Russia's shadow fleet. A G7 diplomat revealed that there are currently 2 possible scenarios, either issuing 2 separate statements or combining them into one. However, Washington's resistance to addressing maritime issues is complicating negotiations. Even what Canada assumed would be an easy agreement has turned out to be much more complex than expected, one diplomat remarked. As the G7 summit approaches, internal disputes persist, with member nations struggling to align their positions on key geopolitical issues.
Hungary unexpectedly supports extension of sanctions against Russia following U.S. pressure. Recently, Hungary, a country that had previously opposed the European Union's EU extension of sanctions against Russia, has shifted its stance after direct intervention from the United States. According to sources, a phone call between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó played a crucial role in this decision. During the discussion, Secretary Rubio persuaded his Hungarian counterpart to abandon plans to block the sanctions package, thereby allowing the EU to maintain unity in its pressure campaign against Moscow. Earlier in January, Budapest had threatened to veto the renewal of these restrictive measures, citing Donald Trump's election as U.S. president and the anticipated changes in Washington's foreign policy. The Hungarian government has repeatedly emphasized that sanctions have harmed the country's energy security, particularly given its heavy reliance on Russian supplies. However, after negotiations with Secretary Rubio, Szijjártó agreed to support extending the sanctions for another 6 months, an unexpected shift for a nation that traditionally holds a distinct stance within the EU on Russia-related matters. Hungary's decision paved the way for the EU to formally approve the next phase of its sanctions regime on June 17, 2025. These measures have been in place since 2014 and are regularly updated to respond to Russian actions. Compromise between EU and Hungary achieved after energy supply assurances. According to Bloomberg, the compromise was reached after Budapest received assurances regarding energy supplies, though the specific details of the agreement remain undisclosed. The negotiations with Hungary reflect a broader context of U.S.-European interactions amid shifting strategies in Washington. As reported by Reuters, since President Trump's return to the White House, Washington has actively worked to coordinate its policies with allies. Earlier this month, the U.S. sent a delegation to Brussels to discuss sanctions, emphasizing the need for a unified response against Russia. At the same time, President Trump also announced plans to reassess his approach to the conflict in Ukraine, raising concerns in Europe about the possibility of a softer stance from Washington toward Moscow.